All right, today's topic's going to be about crystal microscopy and analytics, a different way of measuring water. Water is a hard substance to get a linear reading on. It's so diverse, it does so many things. It's simple on one hand, but it's extremely complex on the other. Um, Andreas Schultz has been working for a long time in this form of analysis. And there's some simple sides to it that are very repetitive and accurate and scientific. And then there's a subjective side. So here we have some objective measurement. And we'll go over have a brief overview of the situation for all those who aren't dealers and maybe not familiar. And that'll tone everybody up. It might be repeat for a lot of you, but we'll go through that pretty quick, and then we'll work our way into the more advanced microscopy, where it gets a little bit tougher and subjective, and there's an art form to it. And Andreas teaches people how to do this. So if anybody's interested, contact the office or email me. And we'll start to put people together to see if we can use this to take advantage of all that water does. Our device kind of opens the door, and I think you're going to see that because of the memory of water and things of this nature, sometimes there's drastic movements in the water depending on the environments, and other times, very subtle, and they carry over as the water is changing, and it's changing all the time. So when you use a flow form and you use transference, you're doing some memory erasure, not completely, I would say, based on the information we have at this point. And I did my best to organize information so we could get some general direction and interpolation going on through this method of analysis. So we'll get started, and we'll go real basic. Like I said, it's not hard to figure that water has a bias towards a six-sided structure, as we can all visually see when it crystallizes in ice, and just absolutely beautiful geometry and perfect geometry in some cases. Through the NMR work of Mushik John, we see that hexagonal water comes in percentages, and they refer to it as a six-ring structure. And with certain NMR methods, even around the cells and in the cells, they're able to see 6 and 5 and 4 ring structure. And then last week we talked a lot about fractality, and we'll brush over that again in the advanced webinar. With a little break after this one, and then we'll go into a review and applications and charge characteristics and things we can really measure with normal instrumentation in the real world, recognizing that water is generally the medium that's conducting all of this electrical balance or imbalance, as it were, to achieve growth and function, and especially in biological things, even though it works outside of that realm to a degree. If anybody has a question, just pop it up, and I'll get as far as I can in around 30 minutes. And if we have to slow down and discuss things or ask questions, that's fine. We'll pick up next month with the remainder of this same topic. I think it's one of the most important topics, and I think for most people, the visual representation with little bit lesser explanation and less deep science going into it is better for all understanding, for marketing, for every aspect of it. And it is very interesting work. One of the things when I was measuring vibrations in water and observing constantly was there was morphogenic behavior of the water's environment, and with the vibrations put into the water. So it didn't really matter what vibrations I put in the water, even though specific ones. So in my research, there was always a morphological nature to waveforms as they were measured, whether they were sound, whether they were magnetic field, whether they were beta radiation, any type of energy that I could easily measure. There was a period of adjustment and mutation before things became fixed into certain ratios in certain places. And when the more three-dimensional view of the vibrations was looked at in a Fourier transfer, there was always a wider bandwidth going on than expected, meaning there was frequencies generated lower and higher that were present that weren't expected to be present for the circumstance. So, here we're making a note that it's not really higher frequency or lower frequency. It's wider bandwidth that we see coming out of the water. Here's an example of cymatics, which is with a light witness, and light is placed and there's a substance placed in the water, and then vibrations are changed to change the shapes of the substance. And it seems to be very temporary in this sense, but latently behind it, we know there's an effect that remains. So even though this is a visual, when you take the sound vibration away, the sound or the light reflecting medium kind of drops out, but there's a structure change that remains even with sound, in the water. And this is kind of highlighting, the rapid morphogenic nature of water. How does the water change shape? Well, the best the theories go now is the spin rates change, which changes their positioning and organization with each other. And that shows up in NMR work. And then here we see proton bandwidth. It's worked by a Russian scientist. And we see a wider bandwidth with what they call activated water. So this isn't the water that the natural action structuring device produces, but all the structure of the water is a very generic term. So there's certain qualities that seem to show up in all of them when you get things going correctly. Today we're going to focus on the macro crystal analysis through microscopy. There is a micro side to it too, but we'll get to that, cover that in a little in the future. What's going on in the method here, so everybody is familiar, is there's a water sample that's taken, and then you take a liquid extraction, and that's by just conventional distillation. And yes, water remains structured under light boiling. Heavy boiling, it's known to distort the structure, so that's a specific parameter that goes on a very light steam distillation. And then the leftover residue that's in just about any water, if the sample's big enough, you'll have enough residue left over to extract the dry crystal. And then the liquid and the mineral extraction are recombined together, and what they call dendritic crystal growth grows as the water droplet is evaporating and forming a crystal. And then you look at that underneath a microscope, and then there's certain correlations that can be made. And like I said, this has been going on for a long time. The Europeans are it's definitely been over 20 some odd years, and they do water quality analysis and have kind of competitions to see who can make the highest quality water based on certain parameters. And they also understand what water is toxic by the water already being known to be toxic in certain rivers, and warned by the governments and things. So those types of rivers have certain signatures when they sample the water, but it's not all the same because it's morphogenic. So some worse than others, and so on and so forth. And then when you get to the microanalysis side, there's certain qualities that pop up that indicate higher level of certain substances that are more toxic and how they behave more or less, I would say, electrically, and it ends up coming out in a visual image. And I've been using the term a lot, allotrope, which means atomically it's the same, but the structure has changed, and diamond and coal are a great example of that. Both forms carbon, but completely opposite in their quality. So we can't take the chemical compound and atomic analysis at face value as the ruler of objectivity, because we also have to look at what form we have. So it goes deeper than a lot of any of our single instruments can do. So we're kind of building a story here with multiple puzzle pieces. That's Fourier transfer is when you're on an oscilloscope. You're looking at the spectral frequencies. So you're looking at the frequencies in a certain range. The question is please explain Fourier. I believe that was a guy who guy's last name. So there's multiple names for it. So frequency spectral is what we're looking at. So I can tell a vibrational scope, to show me the magnitude in decibels of all the frequencies that are present in certain ranges. And so you set the range for resolution. So if I just want to look at ELF, I can set it to 0 to 10, and I can see very accurately what's going on in the ELF range. Or if we're like zooming out, I can say 0 to 100 megahertz and look at all the frequencies present. And water does some very interesting things with the decibel rating that I don't think has really ever been talked about with spectral analysis or frequency analysis when you're measuring vibrations. And there's distinctly some things going on that are opposite of how the whole oscilloscope is taught, and electrically and with just frequency analysis. So another example would be if we look at a sine wave with just a circle or a half a circle above some kind of reference line, and we see a perfect circle, both sides are equal, and we'll see a frequency for the time period of that rise and fall perfectly symmetrical. Well, when you put asymmetry in that, more like an egg shape, where if we chop it in half and look at the rise on one side and the fall, you see there's a fast rise on one side and a slow fall on other, coordinated by the phi ratio by no mistake. And you also see electrical vibrations do that in the presence of water at times. Water will do a lot of things to vibrations, and it's not always so evident, just like the phi ratio isn't always right in your face. Sometimes you have to calculate and look at different ratios to arrive at that. At any rate, there's two different vibrations there that show up on the Fourier transfer or the frequency analysis, because it can sense the rise and the fall time, and so you'll see those frequencies show up. So if it was 60 hertz, perfect circle, we'd only see 60 hertz without any other harmonics present in an ideal world. And if we put some asymmetry in that, we would see the 60 hertz, but we would also see, at a much lower magnitude, albeit, the rise and the fall that's longer. So we'd see some other frequencies that were faster, say 90 hertz, and then a lower frequency. And so that again is this asymmetry seems to open up a bandwidth, and water does some very interesting things with that harmoniously or musically. A lot of you are familiar with this shot. This is a water crystal after it's gone through a flow form, and you see that there's kind of an inverted hexagonal pattern, or the linear version, more 60-degree structures or off 90-degree structure. And here we'll get into where the objectivity is. When right angles show up in the crystalline structures, such as the lower picture, it's almost always going to mean that the water has problems going on. And usually it's more than just energetic problems, which is at the root of it. It goes off into the waters, carrying excessive amount or saturated amount of toxins, and that water is generally considered unhealthy. It can come from pumping. It's different for every type of pump, and the distance and the piping and the materials in the pipe and so on and so forth. And so when you measure the water along a pipe length, you can see that the further it goes down the pipe, the longer it's pumped, the worse and worse the water quality gets. And you can just visually get a feel for that, understanding that the 90-degree angles are indicators of really low and unhealthy water quality. And then as water moves towards quality, it takes on different types of natural structures but there are some exceptions. So that's where it gets artistically subjective, and you would have to have a lot of experience to make statements, and there's more research that's needed to pair it up with other crystalline structures to sense what's really going on. We won't get that far into it. We're just going to be getting a feel for the different recordings and the different pictures. And here's some simple examples of water being pumped. And the 90 degrees and the scribbles starting to show up in high degrees of surface area and frequency. But you also see there's a memory of leaf-looking structures in here, kind of, four-sided and five-sided, little bit asymmetrical, kind of disordered. And that's what you see start to go on is the 90 degree and the scribble and the black spots, the densities tend to start to take over. And then you see less and less of the other. Depending on what the water's been through and so on and so forth. And there's also ways to very rapidly rectify this so that water can, just by vortexing or eddies or turbulence of some organized level, which is what we call a vortex, is just organized turbulence, you can get effects. So you'll also notice that the shapes here are very simple, and they're not going to come out six-sided a lot. The surface area in the shapes isn't going to be very high, and so on and so forth. The fractality isn't very high. Here you see, the correction almost instantaneously. And within this picture, you still see some distortions and things that carry over. And this same water, if we set it in sunlight, would change to circles. This structure would go away and it would change to circles. So as far as using it and drinking it, that's why we say, it's good to use it at point source with structuring is the best. And here is, we'll have some more tests run on this with our unit and update and get some more understanding of our unit and different types of water. There's a pattern that comes out to be a radial pattern, not quite asymmetrical or 60 degrees, but again, it depends what you're starting with the water because it has that memory, and that memory does affect what it changes to, as apparent in the photos you'll see. And we start to see surface area going up and radial structures. And in particular, our device, because it uses certain substances, tends to lean towards a certain type of structure. Which is going to be a little bit different than other types of devices that have different materials in them, and there's specific intentions and design in there for that. The tap water sample used here was actually a tap water sample. That's a mistake on the distilled water control. Is the tap water was also distilled in the same method. That could be a little bit confusing. And you see really obvious 90-degree angles and a little bit of circle structure, which could be substances, and it can also be caused by direct exposure to light. Light can cause other effects to happen too, especially directed, but it seems like when you use sunlight or wideband frequency, all the colors within light, you end up getting circular formation. So you can actually destructure water back into circles, or you can take really screwed up right angle water and make it into circles, which would improve the structure. So I think the big point here is degree of. And here we see a water after it was pumped, and you see the circles. I would guess that both of these waters are exposed to direct sunlight before this analysis, or some type of wideband frequencies of all the colors of light. When you give it a specific color, it tends to do different things. So this is out of Lake Constance in Germany, and give you a little background. Andreas Schultz works with and has traveled around the world many places to sample water and check quality, and there's certain characteristics and unique to where the water comes from and what's going on in that environment. And it seems like there is a harder copy to the type of water, because certain waters, if you pump them, they go immediately to right angles. Other waters, if you pump them, they're not completely destroyed. So there is source quality, even if you structure that's going to give you an advantage. And there's additional things you can do. And if it's already reset and recalibrated through a flow form and a structuring device and a good one, you can do all that much better with what else you're going to do, from how you store it to vibrations around it, to the shapes that are around the water, to your thoughts. It's really, really broad, and those are all subjective things. So it's good to have a mechanical, scientific thing that does the job, but there's more to it than that. And just about any water can be reset reasonable if it doesn't have too many mechanical toxins into it. And there isn't much to indicate in the analysis and science that goes beyond this, that the energy of the water is very, very important. Even with no substances in it, if the energy of the water is not good, it can cause things and encourage things that are less than biologically beneficial if it's been mistreated. But and there is a benefit where if you put toxic energetic water on top of actual physical toxins, that might make you really sick. But it does not get rid of the toxic state. It may buffer that, but it does not get rid of that, the best we can tell with all the information we have. There's been a lot of talk about that stuff, and absolutely people go to Mexico and Bali and India and drink the water direct and they don't get sick, but that doesn't mean that they're still not putting toxins into their body. And we do know that the structured water helps remove those toxins from your body better, but we want to be clear on the language, on the idea that nothing's toxic in the water anymore just because we structured it. But here you can see it moves through phases. This is the distance thing. So at the suction of the sump or the pump, sampled out of a lake, and again you can kind of see the round circles are going to be indicative of exposure to light, and usually direct sunlight when they get heavy. And like I said, it could be other materials doing that also, but you'll see the trends as we go through the slides a little bit more. And here you see it finally goes to right angles. It gets a little mangled after some distance, and then it goes to, flat out right angles and loses its surface area. Here's an interesting shot of your blood is primarily made of water, and it will do the same thing. And then here's more Mains water from, I believe this is Stuttgart, Mains, which is from Lake Constance, which you were just looking at prior, and you start to see the same patterns. Victor Schauberger made the statement that the way we're treating water is itself going to breed an environment that causes cancer. So if you're drinking that water all the time and not correcting it, plus whatever else is going on. Here you see high quality spring water, and it starts to look like vegetation, and it all starts to make sense. The water's what shapes the plant, and the plant is what shapes the water. So plants are structuring devices, and so even, water that's not very good becomes good as it goes into the plant. Neutralize the toxins. I mean, we have no science to actually say what that means, since toxic means how much. The question is, I thought the structuring neutralized the toxins. Well, your body and everything becomes toxic in your body once your body takes the energy out of it. And this is a really difficult topic, because toxic is a relative amount of how much of a substance to a relative application. So, there's people who can work in toxic environments their whole life and they never really get any severe side effects from it. Other people are in that environment for 15 minutes and their whole body goes out of whack. Does structured water help mitigate toxic effects and help eliminate toxins from the body and change the energy signature of what's in the water? Yes, but I can't be the judge of what's toxic or not, and our science is not good enough to define all that. Right now, the current definition in our societies of toxic is a certain amount of a substance, and if it's measured in the water, then it's considered to be toxic. And so when we back up on our regulations and on our institutions, we need those types of things because people could start making all sorts of stuff up, and then you end up giving bad advice. So, does it improve the situation? It appears by all the science we have, yes, to a large degree. Does it make it non-toxic or take away the toxicity by the definition of our current science? No. There are people who believe that and do that, and they do just fine. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen in the real world, but we have to go with science. Fluoride's found naturally. So is chlorine. So if you're, it's going to come down to the amount, and it's different in every city. The structure of fluoride and chlorine change in the water. As you can see, this is what we're looking at, is the residues left over. So the whole of it changes, and we would assume each part changes in order to change the whole. And it's your body's ability to get rid of it, which your body has that natural ability to remove toxins, and structured water helps that condition. So it's a degree of, a lot of the questions are on off. Is it toxic? Is it not? Fluoride, yes. Fluoride, no. And so on and so forth. And it's not a digital answer. It's not an on off question. It's the degree of, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit more subjective than everybody's talking. I think this world wants quick answers, yes or no, and there's not much yes or no to the nature of water. It's much more analog or smooth and continuous with its evolution than an on-off situation. The question is, does structuring make toxic matter absorbable and unable to adhere? Again, too specific of an answer. And toxic matter, there's no such thing as toxic matter. Toxic is purely defined by the amount. There is no, you have uranium inside you right now, and that would be considered one of the most toxic substances, and it's necessary for life. So is fluoride, so is chlorine, and so is every atom on the atomic table. It's going to come down to how much. When charges become saturated and overbearing, that is the idea. I mean, think about your elimination system. Everything you eat becomes toxic if in your body. Everything you eat in your body is designed to deal with that, and structured water and your body structuring water is designed to deal with that more effectively. So if you start with better quality water going into the body, your body's going to add to it because it's a structuring system in itself. And so it's always degree of, and the idea here is to make healthier water, not to eliminate every problem known to man. So, I understand that the company had a different structure before, and there was a lot of things said, but we have to look at this from a realistic point of view and not take away from the water, because it's just absolutely, amazing. Here's another shot going into high quality water, and then what happens to it after it's pumped. And here you see that the reason why I put this one up is because there's not right angles, and more or less this water was high enough quality where it was able to hold on and not form right angle structures even after it was pumped. Just as, I said, other waters, turn right to right angles. And there's a history and a memory and a complex story, much like water's living just like you are. And maybe a lot of what is inside of us comes from the water itself. It kind of makes sense if you think about it, especially since the brain's 90% water. Here we see water exposed to direct sunlight from a spring lake and Great Lakes. You see some hexagonal structures in there, but you also see a lot of black blobs, which is both energetically and physically attributed to the toxins. And then you see the Chicago River, a lot of right angles, a lot of black clumping in the crystalline structures. And you can zoom out on this stuff or zoom in. And we're right at the 30-minute mark. I can go for about another 15, and we take a break and hook on Well, actually, I got the other one at 3:45. The advanced, it's a separate webinar to separate out the two. So I'll have to wrap it up here pretty short, and we'll finish this next month. We really get into the good stuff after this, but this gives everybody a visual opener on what is going on in the simple. When 90-degree structures show up, we're starting to have water quality problems that aren't good for biological life. And you can test this in application. It shows up in growing plants and versus plants experiencing a different water. One of the best witnesses we use. And here you see seawater shot. And it doesn't really have a whole lot of right angle structures in it. It has some triangles and things like that. And you know, we have sodium chloride in there, so it's affecting the structure of the salt condition. But then we see, you know, it goes through a desalination process, which is pumping and boiling and aggressive boiling and all these types of things. And the right angles start popping up more and more. Let me see. We'll find a good one to close on. I think this is a good spot to stop, and then we can take any questions. As long as we'll have to stop at about 6:40, so I can get or 3:40 Western time there, and I can get on to the other one. This one here. So no, the question is this RO water? No, but we will be looking at some RO water, and there's some interesting stuff there. There's been a lot of talk and bashing of RO water, but it turns out that RO water has some issues, but it really makes a unique structure that's not bad. And after you structure it through RO, the water is really good quality. It won some of the best awards for water quality when they RO it and then structure it. And then we'll talk about the negative side, but we'll get into that in the next webinar. It'll take more time, and you're going to be looking at a lot more specific things. That it's going to get a little tricky, not as simple as on off. Here you see good quality spring water on the left, leafy structure, radial structure, reasonable amount of surface area. Then you pump it. It starts distorting and getting linear structures, and then you expose it to sunlight, and the linear structures go away, and it goes back to more the circular blobs, and you start to see some crystalline looking structures forming in that sample that are somewhat similar to the original shape that it came from. So you're watching water, you know, in a very lively circumstance. Then we would say moving towards the end of its life cycle, and then sunlight would bring it back, and it's like age. So the water exposed to sunlight ends up looking like juvenile water that's tapped from really, really deep bores, that's not been exposed to anything, hasn't picked up minerals yet, is not spring water. So we call that juvenile water, and its quality is not as good. So deep well water of certain types is very juvenile and hasn't picked up the good memory of all the minerals and things like that in it yet to hold that energy pattern. And then you can see what you start with, how these patterns get erased, and then how we start to bring it back into the life cycle. And sunlight plays a role in that. But sunlight on the right would actually ruin the structure on the left and make it a lower quality water. Schauberger talked a lot about that, about chopping down trees by river, exposing them to direct sunlight, and watching the rivers basically die after that, and the fish populations changing, the vegetation changing, the whole entire environment degrading due to the insertion of heat and random wideband rays. Whereas the leaves, shade and filter color, you start to filter green, into the water through leaves. And that has a whole different effect. Specific color, make different structures in the water. So it's a good place to stop there, and we'll answer these questions here. Yeah, the Europeans use this method along with actual physical measurements from, probably mass spectral, what's in the water. and I think they're allowed to use about any water, and then water treatment system after it to generate that qualities, because they actually cite where they pick up the water from originally, and then they treat it. And RO seems to come out pretty good as long as it's structured. Filtering has some issues due to the memory effect, which actually shows up. And we'll bump into that on the next one, where we can spend a little bit more time as this story gets a little more complicated. And again, if anybody's interested in getting together and doing this, it doesn't matter if you're a dealer or not, but we're trying to get together a group of people so we can fly Andreas Schultz over, or perhaps somebody who is trained or has been trained by Andreas Schultz, who can teach a group of people over here, so we can make that more cost effective and learn this technique. And then we can start sampling our own tap waters and bottled waters. Some bottled waters come back very good on this analysis, and other ones come back terrible. So it we'll take the guesswork out of it to the degree of, kind of the more natural and vegetative looking the structure is, generally the higher quality is going to be. And there's some exceptions we can talk about with transference. That's what I understand at this point, and I'm always trying to extract more information from Andreas and the situation over in Europe, and other people who work with him and know him as well. Next question is, can one say that structured water can move out a lot of the heavy metals and whatnot out of the body quicker than normally, so the bad stuff would not accumulate in the body as much as bad water? I think that's fair to say. We see that tendency in the increased ability to pick up and carry things away, and the increased number of 5-ring structure that's associated with a toxic body, typically in and around cells, would indicate that water is attempting to carry that stuff out more with a common sense view. I think that's fair to say, when you get into the medical side of things and all that, but detoxing with structured water is a commonly known thing, all the way down to curing being part of an adjunct process of becoming chronic disease free. It's not unheard of, but it doesn't happen to everybody, because it has to just be more than the water itself that's helping. And I think in the next one, when we get into all the things you can do with water, you can really make it effective for doing what you need it to do. I'm a little conservative with what I'll say and whatnot in the face of the company, but unscientifically, water can do a lot more than science will give it credit for, and I don't mind talking about that. But to say it's a fact and water does this and doesn't do that is difficult, because it's just like a personality. So what we're going to start to see here is water has a personality. What happens when structured water gets filtered? We will cover that in the next one. It changes when you filter it. It seems to be due to the transference. It changes the energy. And if your filter's building up junk, it's going to have a negative effect, is what we're going to see. Next question is, a swimming pool with structured pool water shaded by trees maintains its quality longer. Based on the information we have, yes. I would say that's definitely true. The pump's going to be working against you and things like that. That's why you put it on the discharge side of a pump, so it's resetting every time around. But there is no doubt that direct sunlight will degrade the structure over what our device does to it. It's going to move it back toward circles rather than 60-degree angles, which isn't bad quality water, but it's not as good as it could be. Based on the efforts and analysis that have gone on with this method. We also see a lot of cross correlation with this method and other measurement systems, and we can do that then. So we'll have to wrap it up here, and I'll log on to the other webinar, which starts in 5 minutes. And that's going to be a quick review, and then we're going to look at some charts and electrical balances. That's going to be more technical and applications, and slightly off the topic of water, more the behavior of energy within water, specifically as science measures it. So we get some language there. Thank you all very much, and we'll get back to it on the next time around.